All right. I figured that's a fun way to start. Introduce our wonderful speaker today. Brad has been a reenactor for 33 years and has worked on 32 movies and TV shows. He was a background artist in Glory, Gettysburg, and Andersonville. I was an actor in the TV show Perfect Tribute. On the American Genealogy documentary series, Who Do You Think You Are? Are you familiar with that? Yeah. He shared information with actor Matthew Broderick on the last 3 days of infantry life of Matthew's great-great-grandfather, Robert Martindale, of the 20th Connecticut Infantry. Brad was the research advisor on 3 additional Who Do You Think You Are episodes. He was the lead researcher and advisor for the Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield film One Last Mountain, which has received 3 awards. Additionally, Brad was a researcher on the TV documentary The Untold Story of the Civil War. That's not all. I had to actually cut a lot out of this.
Sorry.
No, this is impressive. He also worked as an advisor for the National Geographic Show Diggers. He's a master volunteer for the National Park Service with over 10,000 hours of volunteer work. Brad has written or co-written 23 books on the American Civil War, and his work is being used in 5 museums across the United States. Now, after the presentation, Brad will have a book signing, so we're going to kind of move this table out. So if you want to purchase a book, you're happy to sign them.
Definitely.
Right? Okay, gives tours of the American battlefields, has been on the Marietta National Cemetery Memorial Committee for 5 years, and has worked on the Wreaths Across America programs for Marietta National Cemetery for 26 years. Brad has been married for 47 years and has 2 boys and now 7 grandchildren. 7 grandchildren. So, welcome, Brad.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's been fun. You know, I've spent a lot of time here in the archives researching, and it's kind of fun to be a speaker now after all the years of hanging out in the research section. The talk we're doing today is called Our First Footsteps of Freedom, and it's about men of African descent who served in General Sherman's army in 1864. Now, as you go in research, you never know where you're going to end up, where the journey's going to take you. And I never thought this would be one of the journeys I would take. It just, when I moved down to Georgia in 1982, I started studying the American Civil War, hanging out with Dr. Sechrist, Bill Scaife, Ed Bears, Gordon Jones at the Atlanta History Center, and Dennis Kelly at Kennesaw Mountain Battlefield. You know, all of them had said to me, Sherman had no men of African descent with him because he was a racist. The one unit that he had with him, he actually transferred them up to Dalton, the 44th United States Colored Troops. So I fell in love with the Marietta National Cemetery in '88, started walking through and just admiring all those that had served and given us so much. And I met a gentleman named David Evans. He had changed 5 headstones in the cemetery from unknown to known. So I cornered him over in the southeast corner wall of the cemetery and said, David, how'd you do it? How did you do it? Well, then he told me that Chaplain Thomas Van Horn's records. Chaplain Van Horn was the chaplain for the 33rd Ohio Infantry during the war. After the war, he was put in charge, gathering the remains of Union soldiers that had died in the Atlanta campaign, bringing them to Marietta National Cemetery. Dave, where are they? How do we get them? And he told me, Record Group 94, entry 158. I created a total vacuum in Georgia by getting up to the National Archives. There were 7 books of records. So at that point, you weren't allowed to bring in cameras and that type of things. So David Evans and I split the cost. We had these records put on microfilm. And David works at the University of Georgia, so he got one of their departments to put them on disc for us, so we could look at them and pull them up. And I pull them up, get them for the first time. Chaplain Van Horn, what he did, I can take you within 5 feet of where every Union soldier was originally buried and tell you what he had on his remains. Unbelievable documentation. 3 graves in the cemetery, grave 10,077, 10,078, and 10,079 are actually the amputated arms and legs of Union soldiers. He would not even leave them on the battlefield. So then the next task, putting all that in relationship to the graves. First thing I do, go out and take a photo of every Civil War grave in the cemetery. Day after day, taking a photo. Well, I get into section F and I look, this is section F at the top of the hill looking down, and there's 238 unknown soldiers in this section. And I'm going, okay, and I start taking the photo. Then I get these photos here of 2 graves. Lewis, Michigan. Very next to him is Judge Garrett, USCT, United States Colored Troop. Okay, then another unknown grave, an unknown grave, an unknown grave. I get back to Chaplain Van Horn's records and I start correlating them. And it simply says next to these graves, colored. 258 colored. If Sherman didn't have any of these men with him, why are these in 1864 death? So we got Union soldiers there. Well, I start digging in and getting up and digging. As it turned out, in 1862, Frederick Douglass was not happy with the U.S. Army in getting USCT troops organized fast enough. So he got with President Lincoln, and they came up and encouraged Congress to pass Bill 323. It allowed for regiments, white regiments, to enlist 2 men per company as what it was called undercooks. They could be enlisted in each of the regiments, in the companies, and they did the meaningless jobs for the men. You know, they took care of the officers, cooked, dug latrines. They were paid $10 a month, and they could use $3 of that to buy their own uniforms. So they were enlisted. 1,249 of these men were enlisted in Sherman's regiment. Most of them were enlisted in December of 1863. The 15th Army Corps, as they were stationed in Chattanooga, went west to Pulaski, Tennessee. They would go, because it was a large slave owning area in Tennessee, and a lot of runaways that were seeking freedom and safety settled there, and it became a large contraband camp. So the 15th Army Corps went and enlisted these men. They formed one formal regiment called the 110th USCTs. These were attached also to General Sherman's army. And these men had been slaves. Now they were enlisted in the Union Army, spent time at Chattanooga, and this is one of the documents. You can see Judge Garnett. Over on the left is the actual area that he was buried at here in the Atlanta area. Then you've got his name, the regiment company, and what number he had as he was brought in the cemetery. And you see those words, they're colored. So then I told you I went and correlated the numbers. I built a database of every Union soldier killed in the Atlanta campaign, from regimental records, muster rolls, service records at the National Archives. Next, it was to take and document each one of these men. You see in red is actually what's on the headstone at Marietta National. In black is what Chaplain Van Horn and his staff wrote about every single grave. So I'm getting in and digging. The next thing to do is I've got the undercooks. I know what they are in the scope. We're in the 1864 early part of campaign. Now these guys had been cleaning and taking care of some of the meaningless jobs. On May 8th, 1864, General Sherman issues Order 62, Special Order 17. All non-combatants, when this army goes into battle, will become stretcher bearers. Any man that lays down his weapon to help a wounded comrade will be brought up on court-martial charges. So you got the drummers, the musicians, the cooks, the teamsters, and these undercooks now are stretcher bearers. One more document that shows you the correlation I made. Now, to get the next records I'm going to talk about and to get them efficiently, because if I had to pull each regiment and go through the compiled military service records to get the names of these undercooks and everything that happened to them, where they were born, what age, all that, it would have taken me a good 35 years to try to get it done. So I got permission after dealing with Ian Blanton and Trevor Plant, permission to pull the muster rolls. These are tabletop records. The first record, it's the primary source record you want to get. Okay, getting that and researching those, so they allowed me to pull 334 of these records, regimental records. It allowed me to do 5 to 6 regiments a day. So then I start going through, I'm compiling each man an undercook and all the documentation. But what I do is I photograph everything, or I scan it, and then the evenings at the hotels and the weeks afterwards are compiling it. Over the 20 years of researching, this notebook contains the names of every one of these undercooks and what happened to them, where they were born, what happened to them before, what they happened to them during the Atlanta campaign. Now, Sherman's moving through the Atlanta campaign. You're getting all these freed slaves that are coming. They're enlisting them all the way through the Atlanta campaign. On the march to the sea, he's enlisting these men as they come. 12 men from Cobb County that would enlist. 27 men that I've documented from the Atlanta area. One of my favorite was Cleve Burke. Cleve's father was freed in 1820, settled in Lawrenceville, Georgia, and opened a carpentry shop. Now, Cleve was taught to do carpentry and furniture as he was growing up. When the Union Army was here after the fall of Atlanta, he would walk to Decatur and enlist in the 54th Illinois Infantry. Served throughout the war as a stretcher bearer. He was mustered out of service in July of 1865, came back to Lawrenceville, and things were tough in the South. You couldn't make a living. So he actually moved to Rome, Georgia, and there he would settle and open a carpentry shop. Sometime after the war is over, he changes his name from Cleve Burke to Cleveland Rambo. I can't wait to tell Sylvester Stallone he was not the first Rambo. So now he's trying to file a pension, but he served as Cleve Burke, and he filed the pension as Cleveland Rambo. He got 12 of his former white comrades to testify in affidavits that they were the one and same person. Well, one of the pension officers said to him, okay, how come you changed your name? He said, well, my comrades, many of them, had talked about Cleveland, Ohio, and it seemed like a good place to live. So I changed my name to Cleveland. And my father always told me how nice his former master was to him and freed him, and their last name was Rambo. That's why I took the name. Cleveland Rambo in 1913 had lost his hearing. He was walking along the railroad tracks just north of Rome, Georgia. A train hit him and killed him. And he's buried in the Rome cemetery. Now, when you talk cooks and undercooks, many people get the idea that this is what you're talking about, that what these men were. They had formal uniforms. This is not what they were at the time during the Atlanta campaign. Maybe up northeast and others they were, but here in the Atlanta campaign, these guys were in formal uniforms being paid. Now, up doing research, I pull a lot of what we call pension records for Civil War soldiers. Some of them can be this thick. Others may be 2 or 3 pages. One evening, the National Archives, I pull Hosea Simmons' pension record. He was a slave in Pulaski, Tennessee, enlisted in the 45th Illinois Infantry, served, and in the pension, one affidavit after another. The picture that you have shown me is definitely Hosea Simmons. I served with him. Affidavit after affidavit. Oh, Brad, please let that picture be in here, please. And I looked through it one time and couldn't find it. So I put it back in the envelope and I slowly walk up to the desk to turn it in. Brad, go back and look one more time. So I went back and I looked. And in a very small envelope, stuck up between 2 pages, was this. This is the only known photo of one of Sherman's undercooks in uniform. This is Hosea Simmons. If you look, and you can see the pocket watch chain, it's still bright gold. So once he put that picture in his pension request, it had never been taken out and back and forth because the gold inlay is above the picture. So it wears off very quickly. The staff at the archives said my feet didn't touch the ground for the next 3 days since I found that one. I'm so proud of finding this because the Georgia Civil War Commission gave me a grant for 2 weeks to spend up in DC to pull these records. This happened during one of those grants from the Georgia Civil War Commission. A copy of this, a scan of this, is at the Smithsonian Institute, African American Institute in Washington. If you go to the Atlanta History Center, you will see a scanned copy of it there telling Hosea's story. He was wounded March 8, 1864 in an event at Roswell, Georgia. He recovered in a hospital in Chattanooga. He wanted to get back with his comrades to join them. He tried to walk in October of 64 down to Atlanta because railroad cars were being used for the wounded and the supplies, and they were being destroyed. He made it down to Dalton, was convinced that I'm not going to make it. Went back up to Chattanooga, enlisted in the 66 United States Colored Troops, guarded Chattanooga, then went out west and served till 1874. He is buried in an unknown grave in Nashville National Cemetery. Died in 1923. Just one of the unknowns. Now, some of the records that I've kind of hit you with, this is a service record. You can see Matthew Moore, undercook. Well, I was presenting these to national park personnel, to historians, to professors at colleges. Brad, this didn't happen. You can't prove it. Well, I've got 250,000 documents from the National Archives now that talk about it. Matthew Moore. Brad, there was none of these. They were stretcher bearers. They went in under battle. While the battle was going on, they pulled wounded men out. Brad, you can't prove it. 74 of these men died during the Atlanta campaign, none of them by illness. It says wounds. Brad, you can't prove it. So I pull Matthew Moore, 113th Ohio, pension or service record, says undercook. So we have the proof right there. He's an undercook. Then these are his service records in the scope, month by month. What happened to him? If you notice, died in hospital, Chattanooga, July 18th, 1864, of gunshot wound. If he was back behind the lines and not doing anything, he wouldn't have died from a gunshot wound. Went to the regimental muster rolls. Noted for June 27, 1864, Matthew Moore, while taking a stretcher, trying to help a wounded man, was shot in the back of the hip, and wounded. Eventually made it to a hospital in Chattanooga, Tennessee, died there. This, when the hospital had deaths in Chattanooga, They already had the Chattanooga National Cemetery that was taking military deaths at that point. This page goes from the hospital to the director of the cemetery to tell that we are shipping the body to you, have a grave prepared. So it's the documentation from them to the cemetery. Matthew Moore today is buried in an unknown grave at Chattanooga National Cemetery. I have searched and searched. I'm close to finding, I'm down to 5 graves that it could be, because there were 5 men sent over at that time frame. But the guy who was director of the National Cemetery in Chattanooga at the time was a complete moron. His record keeping was sinful, to say the least. Now you got James Moore, undercooked. All the red lines indicate how many records are in each file, so you know they're consistent. And in these are just where I get all my records from. Now this set of compiled military service records, it jumped out at me and hit me in the face. All right, just basically undercook was what was written. Undercook of African descent. Thomas Jennings of the 31st Ohio Infantry wrote on the service record, American citizen of African descent. Before that, with the Dred Scott decision, the Fugitive Slave Act, they were considered property. William Jennings himself took it upon himself at that moment, American citizen. Imagine being in that room and you're signing up. You've been thought of as property to that moment, and somebody throws out the Dred Scott decision, the Fugitive Slave Act, and says American citizen. That is the first time that I can find in American history that a man of African descent was classified as an American citizen.
What year?
That was 1864. Now you can imagine how that jumped out at me in going through the records. Now again, some more, I just want you to know the 250,000 documents that I've gone through. Well, now we know from those documents and the work that Sherman had men of African descent in his regiment. So I'm still digging. Pull the 25th Wisconsin regimental books. These are the day-by-day activity. Get to June 16th, 1864. This sketch is in the regimental book. It's, you can see, 2 men of African descent carrying a stretcher. Okay. Well, Brad, how can you know it's a black and white sketch? How can you know it's a man of African descent? Right next to that sketch, written by a man of the 25th Wisconsin. On June 16th, 1864, we had a fight at Kennesaw. We had to withdraw and leave our wounded upon the field, and within moments, almost overcome by emotion, 2 of our cooks, who were black, and 2 of our musicians, who were white, grabbed stretchers, ran out upon the field under fire to retrieve our wounded. When they reached a man, they laid the stretcher upon the ground, rolled him up upon it, carried him back to a place of safety. They did this on multiple times, not worrying about their own safety. 2 of them were white, 2 of them were black, and you did not have to go back to old Sparta to find bravery today. You found it in our front at Kennesaw Mountain on June 16th. And I think most of you know what it meant to be called a Spartan hero. The Greek Spartans were the best fighters. Everybody in the world at one time were scared of the Greeks. So Spartan hero, Spartan hero. Now, as I'm taking photos of the National Cemetery and these graves, and I know it's hard to believe, but I had another aha moment, an incredible moment. I'm taking photos section F, and this is in one of the graves in section F. Emma Stevenson, E. Stevenson, nurse, July 16, 1864. Oh, Brad, we have a Civil War nurse buried in Marietta National Cemetery. Oh, my goodness. Oh, wow. I go back and I get to Chaplain Van Horn's records. Simply says, Emma Stevenson, nurse, 17th Army Corps, July 16, 1864, buried 150 yards south of Marietta, Georgia, in 17th Army Corps Cemetery. So now we have what is documented, the only nurse of African descent during the Civil War in the Union Army to die, Emma Stevenson. All right, so I'm digging and digging. I'm pulling all the hospital records that I can get from the 17th Army Corps and pulling what is called mother's pensions. In mother's pensions, I have found 22,000 Civil War letters from men who had just died during the Atlanta campaign. Asa Soper died in the 34th Illinois, died in the hospital where Emma Stevenson was. In his pension were 17 letters. So I'm going through them. July 8th, 1864. My dearest mother, I know you saw from my last letter home that I'm in a hospital in Marietta, Georgia. Do not worry for me. We have a slave nurse that is caring for us. She cares for us with the same tender, kind, and loving hands you would. God has us in his arms, your loving son, Asa. Asa would recover from her care, go back to the regiment, and on August 8, 64, he was wounded in the right arm. It shattered it. He was brought back to the hospital, and he died there. Emma Stevenson died July 16th. The cemetery was just south of Marietta, had a picket fence around it, and it had on the picket fence, "Rest here, brave comrades, your work is done." So now, in the Chaplain Van Horn records, as I'm digging, you can see from the poster board on your left, that is the 17th Army Corps Cemetery. Up in the right section, that is actually a map of the burials of the cemetery, of that cemetery. So we go through, they put them in numbers, but I correlated the numbers back to each grave. Emma Stevenson was grave 23 in that cemetery. And she was placed upon a hill in section F to be buried. And the men who died in the hospital that she was there are buried 50 yards just down the hill from her. So after 153 years, she is still overlooking and taking care of them. And you get to see there's a close-up of all that. And, you know, they say little things can make the man in itself. This is a picture of Hubbard Pryor. Okay, and they were taken the same day. Hubbard on the left as a slave, freed slave. You know, the clothing. He is depressed, not feeling proud of himself. By the end of the day, he'd enlisted in the 44th USCTs, and he has his uniform and the pride. And he's standing up with that pride. What little things can do to impress a man of character. Well, now we know General Sherman had men of African descent with him. It's now being accepted by all those professors and the national park historians. And Hal was there. These are the list aboard a list of where these men were killed. 74 of them, again, were killed or mortally wounded during the Atlanta campaign. If at that time the documentation was placed in, every single one of these men would be Medal of Honor recipients. Every single one of them. Go with that. That's the job of what they did. And if you're a descendant of a Union veteran that survived the war, was wounded, survived the war, maybe one of these men carried him off the battlefield. Now, I told you there were 258 graves, of the 238 of them are unknown. In the research, I've actually documented 147 of these men that are buried in the 238 graves. And this is a list of those men, and they died during the war. And I know they're buried in the cemetery section. I just don't know which grave they're in yet. But if I can keep up the work, now that the archives is open back up, I can get back in and and do that work. But, you know, you never know where your journey is going to lead when you start it. But this has been a fun journey. It's been to find these and tell these stories. It's been a really fun journey. I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. And I know I gave you a ton of information.